So first I want to read this. This is from the book of Acts in the Christian Scriptures, the second chapter. This is from chapter 2. When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly, a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment because each one heard their own language being spoken. Utterly amazed, they asked, "Aren't all these who are speaking Galileans? Then how is it that each of us hears them in our native language?" Parthians, Medes, and Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretans and Arabs. We hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues. Amazed and perplexed, they asked one another, "What does this mean?" Some, however, made fun of them and said they've had too much wine. Later on, Peter talks to them and says, "Brothers, it's only 9 o'clock in the morning." Yeah. So first, again, happy Pride Month to everyone who celebrates. We should all be celebrating. Today is the observance of Pentecost for most people in the Christian tradition. It varies from certain groups to others, but it might happen in another week or so from other groups. But for most Christians today, it's a celebration of the day of Pentecost, the story of that I just read. And it's traditionally believed that Pentecost is the beginning of the Christian church. And I just read to you those first 13 verses about that. Now, Pentecost means 50. So it means 50. And it came 50 days after the end of Passover with the Jewish celebration of, Debbie, tell me how do I pronounce it? Shavuot?
Shavuot.
Shavuot, there you go. See, it's always good to have it every day. For me. And so these people had stayed in Jerusalem after the Passover in order to be part of this celebration. And Jesus' early followers, including his first 12 disciples, were there. They'd been there for 2 months since the Passover, since the crucifixion of their master. They'd been in hiding. They were afraid of the Roman and Jewish authorities. They pretty much stayed in one place altogether. A small group of people, still just about 12 or so people in that room, men and women together, just afraid of being arrested, possibly being put to death as well. And then suddenly they're transformed. When, according to the story, the Holy Spirit descends on them in the form of tongues of fire, and they're suddenly emboldened to go out into the streets and begin to proclaim their faith in languages that they didn't even know. They didn't have Rosetta Stone, they didn't have Babel, they didn't have all those things that we have now in our language. They just started speaking other languages. They were speaking in tongues, and you probably heard that phrase. Did you know, or maybe even you've met people who were part of the Pentecostalist movement. That's a gift of the Spirit in their tradition, and people often speak in tongues in those meetings. Although I have to say, they speak in languages that don't make sense. They're not languages that other people can understand. But the disciples here were speaking in known languages that they had never learned. And so the rest of the story continues. As I said, Peter begins preaching the first Christian sermon right there on the spot, proclaiming Jesus to be the promised Messiah and exhorting those hearers to believe and to be saved. And it goes on to say that about that day, 3,000 people were converted, and the church grew exponentially. Now, again, I have to say that this is legend. This isn't necessarily literal truth. It's not something I believe actually occurred. And yet, it has influenced history for almost 2,500 years, when you think about it. A couple hundred, give or take a couple hundred, right? And there's still a lesson for us as Unitarian Universalists in the story, even if we don't accept it literally, even if we don't believe that this really happened. It's a story that I believe is far more important and compelling than any miracle of speaking in unknown languages. And it's a lesson that connects deep with our own Unitarian Universalist belief and commitment to diversity, not only in our congregations, but in our own lives and in the world at large. Those of you that have been members of this congregation for a long time know that our congregation was begun as an intentionally diverse congregation when the UUA decided we needed to start becoming a more diverse denomination, particularly in areas that were already diverse and that were having problems. That's how our congregation began. It grew out of the idea of diversity. Our Unitarian Universalist faith is a celebration of diverse beliefs. And this is one of our greatest strengths, right? It's one of the best things about us in an increasingly diverse world. The Reverend Kevin Carson writes this. He says, if you log into Facebook or open your email or even turn on the television these days, it's clear that America is a land divided. And though the focus has been on politics, it's not just a matter of Democrats versus Republicans, or whether we're pro-Trump or anti-Trump. We're divided by opinions on race and gender equality, and whether or not our religion really does not require us to feed, or really does require us to feed the hungry and welcome the stranger. We're divided by an economic system that has created inequality between the haves and the have-nots. And we disagree on who or what is to blame, and what we should do to fix this problem, even if it doesn't need fixing at all. We look around and try to discern who is friend and who is foe. We align ourselves with camps of like-minded folks on issues like immigration and climate change. And too often, we're unwilling to even listen to differing points of view. For some people, even objective facts seem to be open to dispute these days if the so-called facts disagree with their preconceptions about the way things really are. Facts. There are many boxes into which each of us can be neatly categorized, sorted, and we can choose to live isolated lives among our own kind, all the while suspicious of the other, who is not like us. Indeed, we are plagued with divisiveness, perhaps the most we have not seen in our country since the Civil War. So let me go back to that passage from Acts 2 that I read earlier. When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place, and suddenly a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. And here's the important part. Now they were staying in Jerusalem, God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. And when they heard the sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment because each one heard their own language being spoken. Utterly amazed, they asked, aren't all these who are speaking Galileans? How is it that each of us hears them in our own native language? Apart from the alleged miracle of tongues, what really stands out to me in that passage is a message of diversity. It says that there were God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven staying in Jerusalem. And then it goes on to say and list all the places that they were from. It was an incredibly diverse crowd of people. And if you know anything about the ancient world, you know that it was diverse in so many ways. Religious diversity, ethnic diversity, diversity of skin color, diversity of sex and sexual orientation. By the way, I want to say this because it's private. Contrary to what is often spewed from some pulpits, Jesus never said one single word about homosexuality. Not one. And in fact, the word homosexual never appeared in any English translation of the Bible, until the Revised Standard Version was published in 1956. And the people who wrote and translated the Revised Standard Version admitted later on that it was a mistranslation, but they never bothered to correct it. So it was an incredibly diverse world that these disciples lived in. Those are the people who Peter and the disciples are speaking to. In 1955, the sociologist Will Herberg wrote a book entitled Protestant Catholic Jew, an essay in American religious sociology. And it was a seminal book in the field of religious studies. I had to read it when I was going to Drew University. And it was widely acclaimed as one of the most important books in the field. Yet, over the years, scholars began to realize that Herberg hadn't grasped the reality of the real diversity of religion in the US. There was little to no mention of Muslims in America, even though they had been here well before the founding of the nation. There was no mention of indigenous religion, no mention of African religions that had been brought here by slaves, no mention of new religious movements that had been springing up as early as the founding of the nation. Diversity has always been at the heart of America. Despite what many people want to believe, the fact that the white population was the majority for so long, or that Christianity was the dominant faith and not the one that the nation was founded on, by the way, does not change the fact that diversity was at the heart of the creation of this nation. Think of the national motto. You know that, right? E pluribus unum, out of many, one. Many cultures, many languages, many ethnicities, many everything. After traveling around America in the 1830s, the French diplomat and historian Alexis de Tocqueville, he described America as the great experiment. That's where we get that phrase from de Tocqueville. Our young republic was something new in global politics of the day. A nation where the government represented the consent and will of the people. It was a democracy where, at least ideally, diverse voices and beliefs could be heard and debated to find common ground and to promote the common good. We weren't perfect. Of course, we're still not. And de Tocqueville rightly criticized the practice of slavery in America as contrary to our professed love of liberty and equality. And then, as now, it was largely white male voices that enjoyed all the privileged position in the political dialogue. But despite those imperfections, it was a glorious, if messy, experiment based on the idea that a diverse people could create a better world in a voluntary community. Our Unitarian Universalist faith, similarly, is a great experiment. In the decades since the 1961 merger of our parent denominations into the Unitarian Universalist Association, we had the Unitarian Association, we had the Universalist Association, and they joined. We've established our framework of 7 principles for a grassroots democratic process to guide our spiritual and diverse spiritual journeys. Our principles are not dogma or doctrine like you see in most religious traditions, right? Rather, they're a statement of our shared values for how we join together in worship and in the exploration of the meaning of life and its holiness, its sacredness. Diversity is inherently welcome because we've embraced a universal understanding of the human story. We have often found ourselves at the forefront of social justice movements, from abolition to women's suffrage to marriage equality. Both Unitarians and Universalists were among the first denominations to ordain female clergy. And we are leading the way far more than most denominations on the ordination of our LGBTQI community today. We've added many diverse voices to our faith story, even our religious traditions. In this room alone, there are people who have different religious traditions, perhaps different spiritual beliefs, but we join together as a diverse community to honor and learn from one another, to grow together. And that's what we do around the country. We've got Wiccans, we've got pagans, we've got atheists, we've got Jews, Buddhists, we've got all sorts of people in our traditions. And yet we still have that deep Christian heritage that we have. And we find, though, many sources of inspiration from all those other traditions. We value diversity in others, and we take seriously the admonitions of Jesus, who said, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." In my Father's house, there are many dwelling places. We recognize the holy that dwells in the hearts of all of you, and that no single religion has a corner on the market of truth. As it says in the Quran, people, we have created you all male and female and have made you nations and tribes so that you would recognize each other. And in the epistle to the Galatians in Christian scriptures, probably written by the Apostle Paul, it says in chapter 3, verse 28, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one. Practicing diversity isn't easy. On either a personal level or as a community, or a congregation, a larger community, or as a world. We see how difficult it is every day. Just watch the news. Or not. Probably not. It wasn't easy for those followers of Jesus either. All of those people were challenged by this radical diversity of the Christian message. Just because it was a bunch of diverse people didn't mean they all liked each other and got along. How were the followers of the way, which is what they were first called, followers of the way? They weren't called Christians until a while later. How did the followers of the way spread the message of Christianity in many languages to many cultures, while at the same time they had to live in that socio-cultural and political world they lived in, the realities of class differentiation, slavery, patriarchy, and the oppression of the Roman Empire? How would they do it? But they did. There were alternative currents, radical alternative currents of spirit that were bursting the seams of what seemed normal. What seemed normal religion, what seemed normal cultural expressions. The Women's Bible Commentary says that women were in leadership in the early chapters of Acts, and they were. They were present at the moment of Pentecost, translating the new imperial messages, it says, into languages from Mediterranean North America, Western Asia, and Southern Europe alongside the men. We have this idea when we read that passage on Pentecost, at least a lot of people have the idea, that it was just the men, it was those 12 disciples, the men. Well, there weren't just 12 disciples, there were a lot more. And a lot of them were women who had leadership roles. We've spoken about Mary Magdalene. Peter explains in his sermon that the outpouring of the Spirit is a gift of God, regardless of gender, of class, or of age. The presence of marginalized populations as bringers and not just witnesses of the Christian message, of that message of diversity, was a powerful statement back then. It says in Acts 2, verses 17 to 18, we read that daughters and women are specifically as prophesiers and bearers of the Holy Spirit, in what the author Richard Hayes calls an eschatological reversal of God setting the world right by deposing the powerful and lifting up the lowly. That's a real radical change in the way the world is going to be. And if you look at queer theology, queer biblical interpretation suggests that Pentecost was both a moment of unity and a resistance of assimilation. In this regard, the theologian James Bohach writes in the Queer Bible Commentary, the Pentecost story is paradigmatic, for it shows the believers gathered together in one place, receiving the Holy Spirit as a group, and yet manifesting the same Spirit in different and diverse ways in order to advance God's one unified reign of inclusion and unconditional love. Unconditional love. When they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment because each one heard their own language being spoken. Utterly amazed, they asked, aren't all these who are speaking Galileans? Then how is it that each of us hears them in our native language? Pentecost is about diversity. It's about understanding that God, whatever name you choose to use or how you understand that word, is not at all about sameness and assimilation. If you're a Star Trek fan, you know, some people think that we have to live in something like the Borg. We all have to be the same. Assimilated, and we're all the same. Cookie cutters. That's not at all what it's about. The Greek word used in Acts, the book of Acts there for spirit is pneuma, which means breath. If anything, the story of that first Pentecost has to remind us of our collective breathing life together into new worlds and into other ways of living. Because we either breathe together or nobody breathes at all. And happy Pride Month. Enjoy the Sunday. May peace.
If you enjoyed this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video.